So in the malfunctioning transporter case, there's a new body's created, and whatever we say about the soul, we could do the same thing with the fission case. Who cares? The soul takes one, the other one gets a new soul. Does it have our memories encoded in the brain such that the new soul would think it's the old soul? Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Sedecase, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today's episode is another special one. I have with me Dr. Kenny Boyce. I've been looking forward to having him on for a while and didn't really even know the topic, what I want. I just want to talk with this guy. But he has been a gadfly on my Facebook for a while, talking about AI and substance dualism, and I'm really excited. Like he's changed my mind through Facebook, so it is possible. So I'm really excited to talk about artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, substance dualism, arguments against AI, and all sorts of stuff. So stay tuned for that, and yeah, you'll be an expert in AI after this, maybe. But before I jump in, I want to thank everyone who's making this podcast happen over on Patreon. If you find value from this podcast, if it's one of your favorites, please consider becoming a Patreon patron. You can support this podcast for as low as $3 a month and as high as $100 a month. So if you do get some value from that, please consider joining the team. I would love to do this full time, and I need support from viewers like you. Also, if you look down here, there's a super thanks button. So maybe you want to give above and beyond Patreon, or you just want to give a one-time gift. You can click that and it'll bring you through. So that's another way you can support the podcast. All right. Well, I might have Theophilus popping in. He's been doing it lately. Try to keep him off my cords. So there might be a guest appearance, but maybe not. Without further ado, though, let's bring in Dr. Kenny Boyce. He's an associate professor of philosophy at Mizzou or Missouri, depending on what context you're in. And he's the man. So let's get going. Dr. Boyce, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, good to be here.
Yeah. I wanted to start off asking you, how'd you get into philosophy and why'd you want to become a professional philosopher?
Okay, how did I get into philosophy? Well, as I look back on it, ever since I was a little kid, I was asking philosophical questions. I remember instances where I was a little kid and I was thinking about determinism and not really understanding it under that label, but I was thinking of it as like a 7, 8-year-old kid.
Wow.
But I thought when I got older that I wanted to do physics. And in part, it was because I was interested in these deep fundamental questions. So when I went to do my undergrad, I actually started as a physics major, and I did get a physics degree in my undergrad, but I picked up a philosophy and religion double major because that's the program they had there. I picked that up because I started to realize as I was doing a lot of the physics that the questions that I was most interested in were actually being asked by philosophers.
Yeah.
And so I became more interested in philosophy. I didn't plan to be a professional philosopher, though. I went on to seminary. I thought I would maybe become a pastor, maybe do academic theology. But while in seminary, a lot of things happened, but I started reading more analytic philosophy just on my own.
Yeah.
Realized that I had a special kind of draw towards analytic philosophy and kind of veered off in that direction. Ended up doing graduate school in philosophy.
What seminary was that?
That was Fuller Theological Seminary.
Okay.
In Pasadena, cool. California.
For sure, yeah. Man, I had a similar experience in seminary at TEDS, and just being like, I want to do analytic philosophy, and it's the old me would have like cringed at that, but now I just love it. I can't stop doing it. So then, you moved on and you did your PhD at Notre Dame, right?
Yeah, so there was a step between. So I actually got a master's degree in philosophy at Mizzou. And then I went on and did a PhD at Notre Dame and then got hired back at Mizzou. So
awesome. Okay. That's fantastic. So that's what I'm doing partially. I finished up at TEDS, and now I'm at PBA working on philosophy of religion, and Lord willing, we'll see. I'd love to go to Notre Dame, but we'll see. I always love hearing about who people worked with, and I think I've heard this before from you, but can you tell the audience who'd you do your dissertation with?
Yeah, so my dissertation director was Michael Ray, and on my committee was Alvin Planiga, Peter Van Inwagen, Jeff Speaks, and Megan Sullivan.
Just legendary. That's so awesome. And if I remember correctly, weren't they all like realists and you were a nominalist defending nominalism?
Yes, that's right. They were all Platonists of some stripe or another,
Yeah.
and I was defending nominalism, so they all disagreed with me, but that made it more fun.
That's so awesome. That's so epic. I love that. And like not just that they were all against you, but they were all like legendary philosophers as well. It's so fantastic. And done like yeah, unique work in that area. That's so cool. I recommend to listeners to go check out Majesty of Reason's episode with Dr. Boyce because they talk about nominalism and much of I believe much of what you worked on in your dissertation as well. So that's another one. Maybe I'll put a link in the description here. But today I want to talk about strong AI and the mind because we've been going. I've been seeing on Facebook all the time. You've commented on some of my posts, and you've really helped me change my mind on well, originally I thought, look, I don't think the simulation hypothesis is possible because I think that's committed to functionalism and the strong view of AI that artificial intelligence can be conscious, and I don't think that's true. So therefore, we can't be in a computer simulation. And I'll put out polls and stuff like that, and you'd be like, "Well, I don't see, like in principle, why you need functionalism for that." So, yeah, why? What's been sparking you to think about this lately? I guess.
Well, yeah, so I should tell your listeners that I'm a metaphysician by trade. And so I'm steering a little bit outside of my lane talking about philosophy of mind. I hope
Hmm.
that's okay.
It's still
I
like metaphysics. Yeah, that's like a
Yeah,
broader
that's right. That's
category, right?
right. Yeah. And sometimes people who aren't directly involved in a field might see things from a
That's right.
different angle that other people don't see. Um, but I, I guess I enjoy science fiction. I'll put it this way.
Yeah.
And I find stories about AIs to be interesting. And there's also been some buzz in the news lately about whether AIs that we have now are anywhere close to conscious. And a little bit more research suggests to me that that's not the case, that they're not anywhere close to that. But still, the general question of whether you could have conscious machines is an interesting one to me.
Yeah.
I have also, like you, thought a bit about the simulation hypothesis and whether that requires rejecting substance dualism.
Hmm.
Um, for various reasons, some of which we'll explore here. I actually think, unfortunately, perhaps for us substance dualists, that it's actually a little bit more plausible given substance dualism.
That's right.
Uh,
Yeah. That's fantastic. So, uh, I got into philosophy of mind because of like Searle's Chinese room argument. And so like I had this idea of strong AI and weak AI is what we have now on Searle's terms, which is just like, you know, algorithms and such, but there's
mhm,
nothing that it's like to be them. And then strong AI, I think, is like, yeah, there's something that is like to be that. In the context of the Chinese room, it's about understanding. So a strong AI has understanding in the way that we do, or analogously. And then when I go into like computer science uh, talk, when I talk with people who are in computer science, they talk about AGI, artificial general intelligence. I just
mhm.
wanted to see if you had any thoughts on like is strong AI and AGI, are those synonymous? Are those picking up the same things? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have some thought. So, as I've looked at the literature, I've seen different definitions of quote unquote strong AI,
Okay.
and they don't strike me as philosophically equivalent.
Mm,
So, some people characterize strong AI as the thesis that just implementing the right sorts of computational processes is sufficient for the presence of consciousness.
yeah.
That's how they characterize strong AI.
Mm,
But others characterize it as the view that computers could have what you called generalized intelligence, which is roughly the ability to perform any sort of cognitive task that a human could and to
yeah.
adapt to novel cognitive situations in the way that humans can. Um, Others have defined it as the view that machines could be conscious and they have a phenomenal consciousness there. There's something it's like to be them. These
Yeah.
definitions strike me as all conceptually distinct. So there's lots of talk in philosophy, for example, about philosophical zombies. In the philosophy of mind, maybe there could be beings that are like intrinsic duplicates of us, but they lack phenomenal consciousness. That
Yeah.
is at least conceptually possible. There's a debate about whether it's metaphysically possible. But suppose you had a philosophical zombie, then it might have psychological states that are in some sense about other things. It might have something like generalized intelligence, but it wouldn't be phenomenally conscious.
Yeah.
And so perhaps there could be an AI that's very similar to a philosophical zombie in those regards. And on some definitions, it would, if that's possible, then on some definitions that entails that strong AI is possible, and on others it doesn't.
Yeah.
So we probably should agree on some definition for the purpose of this interview.
Right.
So when I talk about strong AI, I'm going to be talking about the view that a computer composed of the same sorts of inorganic components as computers we have today could be, or at least could host, consciousness. So it could either be conscious or it could host consciousness. I think that's an important disjunction. But yeah, it either could itself be conscious or host consciousness is what.
Yeah.
And by consciousness, I mean phenomenal consciousness. So there would be something that it's like to be it.
Yes. Okay. Okay. I really do like that disjunct. So, just a little rabbit trail here. So, as a substance dualist, do you think that the body hosts your body hosts your consciousness, or that maybe your brain? Yeah, I'll let you distinguish, but let's go with brain, and you can say body if you want. Does your brain host consciousness, or is your brain conscious? What do you think?
Yeah. So I think that strictly speaking, material things cannot be conscious.
Okay.
And so my brain, my body, as material objects are not conscious.
Okay.
But obviously there's some sort of intimate relationship between my brain and my mind, or I'll say my brain and my soul. I take myself to be my soul, and I take myself to be embodied.
That's awesome. I love that. I'm with you. I might have a hard time pushing back because that's fantastic. Okay, so let's keep going with strong AI then. You've been it's not, I don't even want to say, like, you've been putting forth some ideas on Facebook, I guess. That substance dualism might actually make the substance independence thesis, which functionalism depends on. It makes it more plausible. Substance dualism makes it more plausible. So I should say the substance independence thesis is like, my listeners would probably know this because I talk a lot about philosophy of mind, but it's something put forward by people like Hillary Putnam against identity theories of the mind, where the mind just is identical to the brain in some way, and like multiple realizability. Dr. Boyce, would you say multiple realizability arguments are the same as substance independence? That's like, you use that argument for substance independence, right?
Yeah. So there's the thesis of substrate independence says, roughly that, whatever physical processes required, whatever the processes required for thought are, they can in principle be implemented in any system where there's the right sort of causal or functional arrangements between the parts.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the motivations for that is that it does seem like consciousness is multi-realizable. So we have these organic brains, but maybe there are Martians. There aren't Martians, but maybe, I don't know, Alpha Centaurians who have a different kind of makeup than we do, but it still seems like they could be in pain, for example. More controversially, but more importantly for this discussion, some people think that perhaps a computer that's made out of silicon or something, that it could be conscious. Even though it doesn't have the same sort of makeup as we do. So the important claim here is that consciousness could be realized by a variety of different kinds of substrates.
Yeah. And I think that it seems so plausible, unless you like have studied philosophy of mind and you're like an identity theorist. It seems so plausible that you just think like, well, yeah, my dog is in pain and I'm in pain, and we're both experiencing pain. Maybe not in the exact same way because we have different brains and stuff like that, but we both have pain. Otherwise, we'd have to say like pain H and pain D for dog and human, or something like that. It just seems so plausible to me. So, but the standard, the common understanding, I don't want to say folk understanding, but like folk understanding amongst philosophers who study this, I guess, is that like, if substance dualism is true, then functionalism is false, and you need functionalism in order for a robot or a computer to be conscious, and some sort of machine functionalism or something, where to be conscious is just to have an input and the right internal states and then the right output. And you're like a
Mhm.
realized Turing machine or something. So yeah, let's like, how does substance dualism make multiple realizability or substrate independence more plausible?
Yeah, so I have two considerations in favor of that claim. Maybe we can go through them,
Yeah.
I don't know, one at a time. They're both a little bit involved. Maybe this first one is a little bit easier to get a hold of. So, the first reason I have is it's just an intuition that I think I have, but many other people have. I suspect a lot of your listeners will have if they consider the cases where we have these thought experiments, and there are lots of these sorts of thought experiments found in the literature where the patterns that are in our brain are replicated in other sorts of systems. So consider, for example, a case where you have some patterns, or you have the same patterns as the neurons firing in our brain, but it's implemented, let's say, in a large stadium full of people doing the wave.
Yeah.
Or maybe you have a system of water pipes being opened and closed in a way that mirrors how our neurons fire, or a system of lights being turned on and off.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if materialism about the mind is true, then, and functionalism on top of that is true, then what it is to be conscious just is for a system, or what it is for a system to be conscious just is for it to instantiate these sorts of patterns or causal relationships or functional roles.
Yeah.
But I think when we reflect on those cases, we have a strong feeling that something is missing.
Yeah.
That's not enough for there to be consciousness. It's possible that you could have systems like that and fail to have consciousness. I think that's an extremely powerful intuition that many of us have. Now, people have appeal to that sort of intuition to argue against physicalism about the mind.
Yeah.
But that might be a little bit quick, because it might be, for example, that all the intuition is really revealing to us is that mere patterns or mere kinds of causal relational patterns are not enough
Yeah.
to ground consciousness. You need something else. Maybe, though, that's something physical. Maybe it has something to do with the subtle interplay of the electromagnetic fields that arise from the currents in our brain, or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who knows? But it's plausible that it's something that depends on the substrate of our brain, if in fact consciousness is seated in the physical.
Right.
But a substance dualist, they can maintain that, yeah, sure, mere replication of patterns itself it's not sufficient for consciousness. It's not metaphysically sufficient.
Right.
But they could also think that it's plausible enough that as a contingent matter of fact, if you instantiate the right kinds of causal patterns or functional relationships, then the laws of nature will result in a soul being paired with whatever system is implementing those patterns or relationships.
Yeah. I like science fiction too, and this always, it just seems so interesting. Like you would accidentally be taking out the trash or something, and you spill something, and all you accidentally realize some conscious state, and like the peas that fell scream out real quick or something. They wouldn't scream because you'd have to have vocal cords, but like some kind of, just like if it's emergent or something, and you realize the right underlying structure on accident, and it just kind of something pops up into existence, and then leaves. I always think that's so fascinating. Like, what if reality does have these under? What if I'm a theist? What if God made reality such that there would be like metaphysical laws or emergent laws or something like that? So you're saying that it's it's at least plausible that that's the case.
Yeah, and I think it's more plausible, given substance dualism, that it's the case that consciousness would get paired with these mere realizations of patterns, in part because the substance dualist doesn't have to say that it's metaphysically necessary that those patterns result in consciousness. I think we have a pretty strong intuition that it's not. The substance dualist can say it's just a contingent matter of fact. It reflects how the psychophysical laws are, or perhaps it reflects something about God's policies for when and where to create souls.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, when you have the right sorts of patterns, a soul gets associated with that physical system.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really fascinating. So would it in the like thought experiment there, I guess, if we can make one, but if the patterns are realized and the soul becomes associated with it, do you have any idea, like, would that be a new soul? Would that be like a what do you make of that? Is it an emergent thing? Because it doesn't sound like Hasker's emergentism, but maybe.
Right. So it's not plausible to me that mere patterns, like, I don't know, turning on off and on water pipes and such, would cause something like a soul to emerge.
Okay. Okay.
That also seems implausible to me. So
Yeah.
the suggestion here would be it's a kind of dualism where there's just psychophysical laws that entail that souls get paired with certain kinds of physical systems.
Yeah.
Now there are
Yeah.
further questions to ask. Um, does reality just have like a stock hold of souls somewhere, and when the
Right.
right kind of physical system arises, one of those souls just gets paired with it, or is
Right.
reality or the law such that they just say that a new soul comes into existence when you have these conditions met?
Hmm.
From a purely philosophical standpoint, if I were just looking at it from a purely philosophical standpoint, I have no idea.
Yeah.
Because the arguments that I endorse in favor of substance dualism, unfortunately, the premises aren't specific enough to tell me things like that. Um,
Yeah.
but from my own religious perspective, I'm a Christian theist. I don't think souls pre-exist.
Yeah.
I think they're created when, sometime sometime at or after our conception. Um, and so since I disbelieve for religious reasons in the pre-existence of souls, I would say that a new soul comes into being under these conditions.
Okay.
But now we're stepping beyond what I have
Right.
reason to believe just from purely philosophical considerations.
Right. Right. Just before we step back from the theological, staying here for 1 second, do you have any are you convinced one way or the other about whether, like, creationism about souls or like traducianism is true? Like, do we inherit? Is it like more of a biological process? Is That's how I see traducianism, that we get our soul in this biological way, or like special divine fiat of God implanting a soul at conception or whenever.
Yeah, so originally something more like creationism strikes me as more plausible. In part,
Okay.
it's just because it's not clear to me what the mechanism would be
Yeah.
for parents getting together and like somehow producing a soul.
Right.
Now, I think there are a couple of different views in the neighborhood of creationism there. So one is that God just kind of on an ad hoc sort of basis creates souls
Yeah.
under certain conditions. But another is that it's a little bit more indirect on God's part. God set up
Yeah.
some psychophysical laws, and those laws just have it that when certain conditions are met, a soul comes into being.
Yeah.
And maybe that does actually require an act on God's part. I suppose I think nothing could actually come into existence without God actually bringing it into existence.
Right.
But he does it as a matter of gnomic policy or something like that, as opposed to just on some sort of ad hoc basis.
Yeah. Of those two, do you find one more plausible than the other?
Yeah, not particularly. No.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I like both of those. I think probably the second one for me. But yeah, like you said, it could be like gnomic, where yeah, because maybe there's like an encephalic, someone, like, when born without a brain or something like that, and maybe God's like, well, I'm maybe I don't put a soul. I don't know anything about that. I don't want to speculate too much and hurt anyone's feelings or anything. So I'll step back off of that. Let's go back onto the philosophical. Um, so we talked about the first consideration there, which is fascinating, man. I love that you're like picking this apart. It's so good. Are we ready for the second consideration?
Sure. Yeah, we can talk about that. Now, this one is a little bit harder to get your head around,
Okay.
but there is this Cartesian intuition that thought requires a thinker. You could
Hmm.
challenge this, but there's this commonly held view that in order for there to be thought at all, there has to be somebody doing the thinking, someone or something doing the thinking. And if we accept that commonly held view, that intuition, that thought requires a thinker, and we also embrace materialism about the mind, we get an interesting result, which is that it's no longer enough that you have physical objects in relationships with each other exhibiting the right sorts of patterns to have thought going on. Those objects also have to compose a larger physical system, or they have to at least be parts of some larger physical system that could be the thinker. So you couldn't have mere objects arranged brain pattern wise. You have to have them be part of something larger that is the thinker.
Yeah.
Now, I think if you endorse that view as a materialist, then you should also endorse a view in the metaphysics of composition, the metaphysics of parts and wholes, called restricted composition.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to need to back up and explain that just a little bit. Common sense, and it endorses the view that at least sometimes material things add up to compose some larger material thing. So the atoms in my water bottle, plausibly, according to common sense, add up to compose the water bottle. The water bottle has those atoms as parts. But now there's this question, well, when do things add up to compose a larger whole? It's sometimes called the special composition question. And one extreme answer to this question is never. Common sense is actually wrong. There aren't things with parts. There's no such thing as my water bottle. There are merely particles arranged water bottle wise.
Yeah.
Okay, but if I'm a materialist and Roger Chisholm held this weird view according to which there might be material simple particles that think, but if we reject that sort of thing, we think that thinkers would have to be composite objects, and I really do think that thought requires a thinker, nihilism is out. Okay, there's this other extreme answer to the special composition question. Basically says, well, composition always happens, or more precisely, it happens whenever you have some things that don't share parts with each other, then they compose something else. Now,
what's that? Is that unrestricted composition, or
unrestricted composition, or universalism, as mereological universalism? Yeah, but it has both of those labels. Now, I think a materialist, at least if they don't want to be committed to some really bizarre, counterintuitive consequences, should also reject that view. And there are a variety of reasons, but one reason I'll talk about for now is it's sometimes called the too many thinkers problem.
Yep.
So associated with my body are all these clouds of atoms. And, if you could see like the individual atoms, if you didn't have the illusion that there was something with well-defined borders here and you could actually see the individual atoms, you'd see it's not clear where the borders are. I'm constantly gaining and losing atoms, exchanging things with my environment.
Yeah.
And
is
so
the problem of the many, Dr. Boyce, is that like?
Yes. So this is connected with the problem of the many.
Yeah.
So there are, many, many clouds of atoms that are candidates to be the cloud that composes my body. And if unrestricted composition is true, then each of those clouds of atoms does compose a material object.
Yeah.
That's a lot like my body. And it seems like if I or my body has what it takes to be a thinker, well, those aren't intrinsically different than it. They have what it takes to be a thinker. Yeah. And so instead of one thinker sitting in this chair, there are perhaps millions and millions of thinkers sitting in this chair.
I love this. And if someone's not following, it's just like take one atom away from Dr. Boyce, and that's a new Dr. Boyce. And then take a different atom away, and take a different atom away, and take a different, and each one of those is a different thinker. And so there's like, I don't know, billions or trillions of thinkers sitting right there. It's so crazy, so interesting.
Right. Yeah. So that seems false, though. Hud Hudson has this really fun quote about the problem of the many, where he says, if it's true, which of us could have a private moment, with our son, or which of us could, this is the best, which of us could keep our vow of monogamy? So, I think we should reject the idea that there are so many thinkers associated with me. So if I'm
Yeah.
a materialist and I want to reject that idea, I need to say composition is restricted.
Hmm.
Not all of those clouds of atoms compose something.
Yeah.
Okay, but if composition is restricted, then we have this question. Well, then under what conditions, in fact, do things compose a larger whole? And
Hmm.
there are many answers that have been suggested to that question, but a lot of those answers, a lot of the plausible answers, have it that the substrate is going to matter. So, for example, Peter van Inwagen's view is that material objects compose another object when they're caught up in a light.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know, maybe you could have, I don't want to say that that automatically entails that you couldn't have like a silicone based life or something like that. So,
Oh, yeah.
but even so, the type of arrangement of matter is going to have to be something lifelike. And that might at least preclude things like the sorts of computers we have now
Right.
with their inorganic parts. Counting is their parts will actually fail to compose anything.
Yeah.
Strictly speaking, there won't even be such things as those computers.
Right.
So if composition is restricted, there's a reason to doubt that. There's another kind of reason to doubt that things like computers could be conscious, because we might think consciousness requires a thinker, thought requires a thinker. In order for that to be the case, if materialism is true, there actually has to be something there that's composed of these parts. But if composition is restricted, it's highly doubtful that there really are computers as opposed to atoms arranged computer-wise or something like that.
Yeah, right.
Whereas if substance dualism is true, then composition doesn't have to occur for a soul to be present. It could be associated with a cloud of atoms, or perhaps one soul could be associated with several different clouds of atoms. Or maybe composition is universal, maybe it happens all the time, maybe it's restricted, but regardless, you don't need it to happen for conscious thought to be associated with the physical objects there. And it also is plausible enough, again, that the laws just dictate that when you have the psychophysical laws or God's policies or whatever just dictate that when you have the right sorts of arrangements of physical systems so that they instantiate the right kinds of causal or functional patterns, then a soul becomes associated with those systems.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, it leads to this conclusion about dualism, yeah, which is interesting too. But it's so interesting to think through, like, dualism. If you go in for dualism, the special composition question, you can kind of pick and choose, whatever you want, whatever way you're thinking, you still get to have that. The universalism, I think, is kind of tough still, because it's like, well, what object would that soul be associated with if every object is connected or something? Like, is there a problem there, or and maybe you already addressed it, but I think I lost it.
Well, so I don't think there is a big problem there. So let's suppose that mereological universalism is true. And in fact, that's what I believe, but it doesn't matter.
Oh, snap. I was going to ask you. Okay.
Let's assume that it is true. Yeah. So associated with my body, there are these numerous clouds of atoms. They all compose a material object. There are a couple of possibilities that I can help myself to as a substance dualist. So one possibility is that my soul is just kind of loosely associated with each of those clouds. Like it doesn't have to decide, oh, I'm just going to pick this one over those others. Or the laws don't have to decide that. You have atoms arranged in the right sorts of ways, and a soul is associated with those atoms. And if there's enough overlap, perhaps between various clouds arranged in those ways, then they only get one soul. They don't get multiple souls paired with them. So there's no too many thinkers problem. Or it could be another alternative is that my soul just kind of arbitrarily selects one of those clouds, maybe through some indeterministic process or something like that, latches onto that. And because my soul latched onto that cloud, that the thing composed by those atoms, that's what counts as my body. Perhaps it has sharp borders and all of that.
Yeah.
Either one of those answers strikes me as plausible enough.
Okay. This is really this is really fascinating. So so the soul could be associated with a cloud. It could be associated with a arbitrary cloud. Could the soul, maybe this was the first one you gave. Could the soul like be informing the cloud, like because I don't want to say the soul, my soul is like my shape. I don't want to go in like for like Casper or something, right? But like could it, maybe that would be the soul arbitrarily picking the cloud, and it's like informing it, and we can use like some Aristotelian language or something if you want. Maybe you don't want to, but do you see what I'm getting at there? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, well, yeah. So I actually like to use a word. It, I like to say that the soul incorporates
Incorporates. Okay.
matter,
Sure. I like that.
but I don't have a very strong definition of what incorporation is. So
Okay.
I'll say this: there are some relations that are they violate the intuitive gloss on intrinsicality that says intrinsic relations, or when something has an intrinsic property, it doesn't have it in virtue of how it's related to other things.
Right, because it's
But there's some
intrinsic. Yeah.
yeah, but there are some relations that do violate that. So proper parthood, for example, if I have a proper part that's, or my body does, that is red, then it's part of my body's intrinsic character that it has a red part.
Yeah.
Um, so
That's
it
interesting.
has, yeah, it has an intrinsic property by virtue of how it's related to something else.
So
Um, and so
that's
I would
so
say
weird.
that, yeah, incorporative relations are relations that violate that intuitive gloss on intrinsicality.
Can you say that
And
it's also an it's still in no. It's like relations are extrinsic, right? Like the redness, it's intrinsic to you, but man, you're blowing my mind here, Dr. Boyce. The intrinsic, and it's like it's violating that condition or principle or whatever rule, and it's freaking me out. Yeah, that's good.
yeah, so I'm inclined to think that embodiment, this is just kind of speculation. This is
Sure,
me
sure.
speculating a little bit about the nature of embodiment. I'm inclined to think that embodiment is also a kind of incorporative relation, that
Okay.
somehow it's part of the intrinsic character of my soul, that it's related to these bits of matter here. And that kind of helps explain why we think there's something very intimate about the relationship between the mind and the body,
Yeah.
that allows a substance dualist to maintain that that's the case. But now I'm starting to speculate beyond
Yeah.
where I really feel confident
Yeah, sure,
about what
sure.
I'm saying.
Sure.
But
I
I'm
like it
inclined to
though. I
think
think
something like that's true.
I think you're right, and it sounds a little bit like some of the more Aristotelian substance dualists or Thomistic guys, which is cool because it's like you're using different language, but I think it's kind of coming around. Let me just ask real quick: if you get your hand cut off, is it still your hand or is it a corpse hand?
Oh, well, I guess in a trivial sense, it's no longer my hand. I mean, it's not incorporated into my body.
Yeah.
Uh, is it still a hand? I don't know. I'm not sure if that's a substantive question or not.
Okay.
I mean, on my view, since I'm a universalist, there's still something composed by the matter, but
Yeah.
maybe it doesn't count as a hand anymore because it's not no longer functioning as a hand. I'm
Yeah.
not sure.
No, that's good. That's really helpful. Yeah, sorry to bring you away from our original AI stuff. It's just so fascinating to me. Um, maybe one more real quick. So like PVI, Dr. Van Wagen says, he's got that condition about being caught up in a life. Um, does the is the soul? I mean, you've said that you are your soul, which I agree. Is the soul, is the incorporation, is that the life? Is that what's like enlivening the body? That's a weird question, maybe.
I'm not inclined to think that the soul confers life. I'm inclined to think that
Oh,
there are living
okay.
things that don't have souls, maybe plants, for example.
Hmm.
Um, but I suppose here's an option for you if you wanted to maintain that composition is restricted.
Hmm.
You could say that the x's compose a y only when the x's are ensouled. Um, and so that would give you a view according to which there are very few composite material objects, but there
Yeah.
are things like our bodies.
That's what I kind of lean towards. I don't like it a whole ton, but I kind of lean. I just need to think it through more because I kind of want to say there's substances, but like gold would probably be a substance, but I don't think gold has souls, and so like it's weird. So I'm yeah, it's a mess. I'm still learning this stuff, but this has been really helpful for me. Um, well, let's pull it back. I'll try and pull us back to AI. Um, so how about a summary real quick, in case people got lost? You have these two considerations. Can you briefly go over one and two for us again? Why substance dualism makes the substrate independence thesis more plausible?
Right. So the first one is just that we have this very strong intuition that the mere instantiation of patterns is not metaphysically sufficient for consciousness.
Yeah.
So if physicalism is true and consciousness is seated in the physical, then there has to be something else going on, perhaps something to do with the substrate.
Yeah.
Whereas if substance dualism is true, there's more flexibility because it's contingent matter, presumably, whether souls get attached to certain kinds of matter. And it could well be that if you have the right kind of functional arrangement, a soul gets attached. The second one is that materialists about the mind have good reason to think that composition is restricted, and that to have a thinker, you've got to have a composite object. But a lot of plausible answers for how composition might be restricted have it that the causal arrangements of the matter and the type of matter both matter, or at the very least that you won't have composite objects if they're anything like an inorganic computer system.
Yeah.
And so again, on that view, it's less plausible. On physicalism, it's less plausible for that reason that something like a computer could be conscious, because it's less plausible even that things like computers actually exist.
Yeah.
Whereas if substance dualism is true, then a soul could become embodied in some matter, even if that matter doesn't compose something larger. And again, it might be that the psychophysical laws just pair souls with material systems that instantiate the right kinds of causal relational patterns or functional arrangements.
Yeah. This is so good. So I think I've been thinking this, but maybe some of the listeners are thinking this as well. That if the project of AI or AGI or strong AI, whatever we restricted it to like a conscious robot or a conscious computer, if the project is to invent that and create that like from whole cloth, and you make, and substance dualism is true, then it seems like you're just you're either by accident, or I guess we could discover some psychophysical laws on purpose and then make this thing that a soul attaches to. But it seems, I wonder if someone might say, well, that's kind of cheating. It's not like we made it out of whole cloth.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we discovered a law, and that law, so we didn't really make AGI. Do you see what I'm grasping at here?
Yeah, I see what you're grasping at. I'll say that there are a lot of things that we can do only by virtue of the laws of nature being the way that they are. So I think we can create a stable bridge, for example. That's something we can do.
Yeah.
But we can only do that because the laws of nature are such that they allow that to happen. And we discover those laws and we take advantage of those laws, and that's how we manage to create a stable bridge. So it could be something similar with respect to the psychophysical laws. We have maybe some empirical reason to think that if we instantiate the right kinds of causal patterns or functional states, we'll have something conscious there. We discover that, we build that thing, we get something conscious. It seems that we're doing something a lot like taking advantage of the laws to build a bridge or to build a rocket ship. Now, there is a difference there, which is if substance dualism is true and souls aren't just in some storehouse somewhere, waiting to be embodied, then something new has to come into existence in a way that maybe something new doesn't have to come into existence for us to build a stable bridge. And so maybe we do get a little less credit for creating a conscious being. But, maybe that from a theological perspective, if we want to go back in that direction, maybe that's a good thing for us to say. As human beings, God allows us. Obviously, God allows us to be involved in the process of creating conscious beings. Parents
Hmm.
do it, but you still need God's involvement in a more direct way as well, so that all persons who end up existing, whether they're human persons or other kinds of persons, end up, in some sense, being special creations of God.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. That's really good. Um, if the okay, so I'm with you here. I'm trying to either anticipate or just generate some objections. If you and if I am I'm my soul and you are your soul, and we create an AGI or a strong AI, the thinker would be the immaterial soul of the AI, right?
That's right. Yes.
Okay. But that thinker, could we rightly call that thinker? I hope this doesn't just go right into semantics, but is it appropriate to call that thinker artificial if it wasn't the thinker wasn't created artificially? I think, right? He was like its soul was attached based on psychophysical laws to this body that we created, but we didn't really create the thinker. So yeah, do you see that?
Yeah, I see that. I don't know. That's an interesting point. I do wonder maybe if that is just a kind of semantical
Sure.
question, because we arrange matter in such a way that it gets consciousness associated with it artificially,
Yeah.
as opposed to natural processes. So in that sense, it counts as an artificial intelligence. And the psychophysical laws also seem to entail that, or that the the nature of consciousness is such that it at least nomically depends on certain physical processes occurring. So hit me hard enough on the head,
Yeah.
I'll stop having thoughts. Bang
So
the
sad.
bang the AI, bang the AI up bad enough, it'll stop having thoughts.
Right.
So what nomically sustains my conscious processes are these natural biological processes. What nomically would sustain the AI's conscious processes would be artificially generated processes. So in that sense, it also counts as something artificial.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, this is good. I think yeah, I'm trying to think if there's like a superhero version. If like Vision or Ultron, they weren't like yeah, they were generated by this like spooky mind stone that like, it wasn't like the Tony Stark says in the movie like, "Hey, were we even close to this?" Like, no. So there could maybe Vision is like yeah, for those who are having a hard time like conceiving of this, Vision or Ultron could be like AIs that were produced. There's like a soul latched onto them. Maybe this is good. I really like it. So if we did somehow get a soul associated, you and I are working on a robot, and a soul gets associated to it. Um, is that a person? Is that robot? Does it have personhood? Do you think?
Well, I don't think having a soul is sufficient for being a person.
Okay.
So my dog, for example, I believe has a soul, because I
Yeah.
don't think, again, that material things can be conscious.
Okay.
But Descartes notwithstanding, it's clear to me that my dog is
Sure.
conscious.
Sure. Yeah.
So my dog has a soul.
Yeah.
Um, but he's not a person. At least I would say he's not a person. Now, some people might challenge that, but I think he's not a person. He doesn't count as a person. He doesn't
Right.
have the kind of moral status that persons have.
Yeah.
Um,
Peter
so,
Singer's in the comments right now, so freaking out.
yeah,
Yeah.
right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, we get into a whole different area here, because I do think that even small infants do count as persons, even
Yeah.
though my dog is more cognitively sophisticated than some of those infants. So it has to do, in part, not just with current capacities, but potentialities. I think maybe perhaps the teleology of the thing, like
Yeah.
uh, what sorts of cognitive abilities it's supposed to be able to realize
Yeah.
in some teleological sense. Uh, so I don't. The AI, it could be a person. I think if it
Okay.
had the right kinds of teleology, or if it had the right kinds of potentialities, it could be a person. but merely by being ensouled or being conscious, that it doesn't count as a person merely by virtue of that. There have to be some other conditions that
Yeah,
are met.
that's really good. So, oh man, this is another. And it's so speculative, but how might we go, maybe like adjudicate that and decide what kind of soul got associated with our robot? If it's self-aware, if it can say Descartes' dictum, going on like Blade Runner or something, I think therefore I am. If it can say that and it's self-aware, and we're assuming that it's not a philosophical zombie because it's kind of hard to test whether something is conscious or not. Oh man, that's another problem. But let's say that we know that it's conscious, or we're justified in believing, or it's warranted, whatever. Yeah, how might we go about like adjudicating whether it is a person or not? Is self-consciousness enough?
Yeah, so I think that off the fly,
Yeah, sorry.
I'll try to give you something in the neighborhood of sufficient conditions for persons. Probably
Okay,
need some refinement, but
sure.
these are sufficient conditions, not necessary
Okay.
conditions. So I guess I count it as a person if I'm aware of myself as a self, if
Hmm.
I am capable of regulating my actions in a rational way, if I have a sense of myself enduring through time. Um, I don't know. That's a start of. I don't think I'm
Sure.
quite even at a sufficient condition
Yeah.
yet, but I think
Probably just
that's a
throwing something about
start.
morality. Yes. I see
Yeah,
myself as a
yeah,
moral
yeah,
agent or
yeah,
something. Because
yeah.
because
Maybe
other
that's required or
because I
not
think people would say
required,
that
but
about dogs, right? They would be, well, dogs do this, and what that's so debatable. But if you're going on like moral stuff, then you're like, well, I don't think my dog's very moral. So, or
right.
at
And
least sees
we're only
himself.
after we're after a sufficient condition here, so we do have to be. Yeah, it has to be the case that you don't have something that meets the condition but doesn't count as a person. So if
Oh
my
yeah,
dog met all those conditions, then it would be bad. But I don't know. It would be bad for my attempt to find a sufficient condition.
yeah, right.
Uh, but I think if we worked hard enough at it, we could find some sort of sufficient condition.
Okay.
It's harder, I think, to find a necessary and sufficient condition for being a person.
Yeah. Well, let's just go with like Vision. Do you think Vision was a person?
Yeah, I think Vision clearly was a person.
Okay.
A character like Vision is that he clearly counts as a person. I mean, assuming that he really is as he appears to be, conscious, self-aware.
Yeah.
Um, now, now it gets tricky. So, like that Google engineer, I think, was fooled by the Lambda system.
Uh-huh.
He thought that it's a person because it appeared to be able to answer all of his questions and assert that it's self-aware. But from what I understand, it's basically a glorified predictive text machine.
Yeah.
It doesn't. Once you understand what it's doing and how it's doing it, you see that no understanding is actually required for it to do what it does, and it's amazing that it can do what it does.
Yeah.
But it's the mere simulation of consciousness or intelligence. It's not. It's not the real thing.
Yeah.
And so uh, it might be tricky to know whether in the future it might get more and more tricky. Even if we grant that there could be conscious AI, it might be more and more tricky to know whether an AI is conscious
Yeah.
without understanding how it works.
Yeah. Because I'm an interactive dualist. I don't, and who am I, right? But I don't know that we know like the psychophysical laws, right? For what makes us conscious. So I think if Vision were here and were, popped up or whatever, it'd be reasonable to treat him like he was a person, even if we can't prove that he's not a philosophical zombie. Because I don't think I can prove that you're not a philosophical zombie, but it's like utterly, it'd be super wrong for me to not treat you like you were a person. What do you make of that line of reasoning?
Yeah, so I think that we can know that other human beings are conscious, that they're
Okay.
persons, that we can know that animals are conscious and that they're persons. But that's because I have a proper functionalist epistemology, and
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
think it's just part of truth and cognitive proper function that we're inclined to strongly believe that there are other minds. In the case of AIs, though, we might be quite uncertain. And then I do think something like a precautionary principle might come into play with respect to
Hmm.
how we treat them. So if we're not sure that there's a person here, we probably should still, out of moral caution, act
Yeah.
as if that is a person.
Yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, that's really good. So Yeah, when I talk with Christians about this, so I work with college students as well. When I talk with just Christians who aren't trained in philosophy or haven't studied this stuff, they'll usually be like, "Well, God wouldn't allow AI to happen," and so it's like for some reason there's like a divine stop where He would stop our civilization even or something like that before it happens, as if there were some kind of like transgressing some natural law. I don't know. You could pull on Tolkien and be like, well, we're sub creators. We're created to
Yeah.
create like him. So there's no problem here. Um, so yeah, oh man, I think I lost where I was going with that. But oh, pulling back on your theological commitments. Do you think, pulling back on your theological commitments, do you think that AI, like, do you think God would allow us to do that? Does that work within your theological framework that God would actually instantiate a soul if we made a complex enough or whatever, tapped into the psychophysical laws? Would He allow that, or do you think no? It's just like
Well,
subverting. Yeah,
I don't see why not. I don't see
yeah,
why God wouldn't allow that. In fact, I was talking with my wife this morning. We were on a walk, uh, my wife Sarah, about this, and she said, "Well, I'm not saying that God would create a soul if we put matter together in the right sort of way, but as parents, we support our children's projects. We allow them to do new and creative things, and we try to enable that by giving them what they need to do that. And so
yeah,
maybe one of the projects that God might support is us giving birth to other intelligences.
right.
Why not?
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think maybe because of our conception of like the Imago Dei, that it would be like, no, we'd somehow be playing God or something. But exactly what you said. Why wouldn't God do that? So I don't. The whole thing's so fascinating to me. It's just it. I love thinking about this stuff. Um, I I wonder if you think like, do you think the Chinese room is like a successful argument against functionalism, that naturalistic or physicalistic functionalism?
Well, what I'll say about the Chinese room thought experiment is, well, let me say a couple of things. So
Yeah,
Searle leans heavily on the idea that when he's manipulating the symbols in the room,
yeah,
he doesn't understand Mandarin.
right,
Um, but a physicalist might push back and say, well, he doesn't, but the room does, or the
right,
system does. So that's a common response.
yeah,
And I think that's a good response. But I also think that once you say, oh, the room does, or the system does, and you think about that, for a
mm,
lot of people who think about that, that will elicit the same sort of intuition that I appealed to earlier, that that can't be enough
yeah,
for consciousness to be present. So you don't get quite as tight of an argument from this case. I think it's just as Searle wants it to be.
yeah,
I think this ends up being one of a general family of thought experiments that elicit in us the intuition that the mere instantiation of certain kinds of causal, computational, functional patterns, that's not enough for there to be a conscious uh, that's not enough for consciousness to be present. It's not
and
metaphysically sufficient, at least.
yeah, yeah, it's I think it's still butting up against the idea, Descartes' idea, that thoughts require a thinker. Because if the room was understanding, it's like, well, we can't pick out the thinker. What is the thinker that is having that thought? Or do you think I if you say that, then you might be committing yourself to like the cogito argument or something, and maybe you don't want to say that. But does that sound right? Does that sound like that's the intuition? That's why people are thinking that there has to be something else because there's no thinker in that situation?
Well, I don't. So I think that's a distinct, I think that issue is distinct from the intuition that
Okay.
I just pointed to. But I also think that there's a significant issue there. So suppose I say the system is conscious.
Yeah.
Um, well, what are the borders of the system?
Love
Is
that.
it the room? Is it the walls? Is it just the things that are like somehow directly involved in the process, the processes going on.
Yeah.
I don't know. And I think this is one of those places where, as a somebody who does metaphysics more broadly, who is kind of coming at philosophy of mind from the outside, it seems to me, as more of an outsider, that philosophers of mind don't pay enough attention to issues pertaining to the metaphysics of composition.
Yeah.
Uh, but I think that those issues are really important for thinking about the nature of conscious beings.
I love that you said that, and I think you're absolutely right on that. I think one person who's begun to think about that would be like Eric Olson. He came on the podcast and we talked
Mm-hmm,
about that, where
mm-hmm.
he was just like, what would the computer be? Would it be, and he was applying it back because he's an animalist, so he thinks like the animal's doing the thinking. But it's like, if you think about your computer, it would just end up being a spidery, weird little web that's doing the thinking, or would it? And yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm really glad that you do have that outsider perspective, because I think you're right, and it makes sense in any field. The conversation gets kind of specialized or turned in on itself, or however nice or mean we want to say it. And so someone outside who still can think about this stuff says, "Wait, why don't you guys consider this?" I think that's
Right,
fantastic.
right.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to end with a couple more things. Associated, related to what we've been talking about, but since you like sci-fi, I think I'm sure you probably thought about this as well. Um, what about, so we've talked about associating a soul with a computer or a AI, or non-organic substrate. What about transferring our consciousness to a different substrate by like gradual replacement or rapid replacement? Do you think that's possible, or if not, like why not?
Um, so I think it's definitely metaphysically possible.
Okay.
As a substance dualist, I think the soul could get paired with something else, other particles. There's no reason why that couldn't happen, where the
Yeah.
couldn't there is a metaphysical couldn't.
Yeah.
Is it nomically possible? I'm not sure, because I don't know that much about the
Yeah.
nature of the psychophysical laws.
Yeah.
Maybe. If I think about certain cases, it seems likely to me that uh, a transfer of that sort would occur.
Mm.
Well, there's a sense in which I actually think that transfer happens all the time, because I'm a mereological universalist,
Yeah.
but I'm also a mereological essentialist. So I think that my soul is constantly becoming associated with different composite objects.
Oh yeah. As
So
soon as
yeah,
one
right.
particle leaves, because you're a mereological essentialist.
Yeah,
Interesting.
that's right. So in a sense, that like transfer happens all the time, given my metaphysics. But I also think it could happen in a more interesting way. It seems plausible to me, for example, that if you started gradually replacing the neurons in my brain with artificial
Yeah.
uh, components, that uh, I would still be conscious, and that if you kept doing that, it wouldn't cause me to fail to be conscious. There is an interesting question, though, about whether that's true. So there was an episode of Star Trek, for example, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, where
Sure.
they operated on this guy. They did just what I'm talking about, but the doctor talked about how there's like this special spark, and if you replace too much of the brain, that spark gets lost.
Huh.
And like his behavior was starting to change, like as they were replacing parts of his brain. He said, I just don't feel the same anymore. I don't feel like myself. And there was a sense that as they were doing this, like his soul, for lack of a better word, Star Trek, the metaphysics is unclear, but his
Yeah.
soul is
Right.
getting less of a grip on his body. Um, and so maybe that would happen. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I think Chalmers talks about that in like fading, in his stuff on fading qualia.
Yeah, yeah.
Um. Well, sticking with the Star Trek, I yeah, man, my initial reactions to stuff when I first learn about them are always wrong. But so I think I'm changing my mind about this too. But if Scotty beams you up, um, this would be like a rapid transfer, right? So he beams
Mhm.
you up. Let's say we're substance dualists. Somehow, they're tapping into like just the psychological laws, or whatever, and transferring your soul to different matter. What do you think about that? Like, is that I don't know how they could have the same spark then, right? Because it's a whole new body. Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
what's going on there?
Again, I think it depends on how the psychophysical laws work. So maybe the psychophysical laws adhere to some sort of closest continuer principle.
Oh yeah.
So, if the closest continuer to my previously ensouled body is this new body that was created on the surface of the planet by the transporter beam,
Yeah.
then maybe that's enough
Yeah.
for my soul to go there.
Okay.
But maybe it's not like that. Maybe my soul requires a continuous embodiment, and once they dissolve me in the transporter, my soul is no longer embodied, and it doesn't become re-embodied.
Yeah.
That's again, on my view, whatever turns out to be true about that, it's a contingent matter, and it could have been otherwise. So when I watch Star Trek, I assume, for the sake of my own enjoyment, that people do survive being transported.
Yeah. Um, Sometimes they mess up. The transporter messes up, and will make a twin or a clone.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts on that with us? Like, if there's, I guess if we're in the Star Wars or Star Trek universe, is that possible? Would they have to split the soul, or like, are they duplicating the soul, or is that maybe a philosophical zombie with no soul?
Well, I think that the result would likely have a soul.
Okay.
Here, I
Oh
think
yeah.
that there's actually an argument in favor of substance dualism.
Okay.
So this is an argument from Richard Swinburne that substance dualism best accounts for fission cases.
Mm,
So if you have like a perfect splitting in half of some person, and then like the recreation of both halves, and then you have two people resulting, materialist views of personal identity have a hard time explaining what's going on. It doesn't
yeah.
seem like you died. Um, People can survive, for example, having half their brain removed. So it doesn't seem like death occurred.
Yeah.
Do you say that death occurred just because there are two equally good candidates to be the original person? Like, if there weren't two equally good candidates, the person would still be there. But because there's this other person there, uh, death occurred. I forget who, but somebody called that death by overcrowding. It doesn't
That's
seem
good. Yeah.
doesn't seem very plausible.
Right.
Whereas if you're a substance dualist, you can think, well, the original soul went in one direction. Maybe it was arbitrary in the same way that whether a photon goes through a half, silvered mirror or something,
Right.
it's indeterminate whether it'll bounce off or go through.
Sure.
Maybe it's indeterminate which way the soul went, but the original soul went one direction, and then maybe a different soul arose in the thing that the other individual that was created. And maybe there's no empirical way to tell who's the original person,
Yeah.
but we can accommodate the intuition that the original person would survive.
And just a new soul is associated with the other one.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Um, this might do you, so in the malfunctioning transporter case, there's a new body's created, and whatever we say about the soul, we could do the same thing with the fission case. Who cares? The soul takes one, the other one gets a new soul. Does it have our memories encoded in the brain such that the new soul would think it's the old soul?
Well, yeah, I mean that's in part an empirical question, but
Right.
empirically that does seem to be true.
Okay.
I don't know how strongly the empirical evidence actually supports the view that all that information is actually stored in the brain, but
Right.
it seems like it does support that view to some extent. So if that's
Yeah.
true, then the other person would have, I guess, quasi memories or they would share the same quasi memories with the other person. A lot of them wouldn't be genuine memories because
Yeah.
they didn't actually do the stuff, but
Yeah.
they'd have the same quasi memories.
Yeah. As I wonder, like, would the one with the new soul, would their concepts like not refer? So they're thinking about like they're thinking about the ship and stuff, but their concept, they've never actually had any causal interaction with the ship. As an externalist, is that a problem? Like, they don't have referring concepts?
That's an interesting question. My intuition about that, though, is that there's a causal relationship between their concepts and the concepts of the original person.
Oh,
That's
okay.
enough. That's enough to make it so that their concepts also refer.
Okay.
So it's a different sort of case where somebody just pops into existence, like a Boltzmann brain or something just
Right.
pops into existence, and they never had any there's no causal relationship whatsoever between their current thoughts and the external world. That case isn't like this. There is a causal relationship because it
Okay.
occurs via duplication. So I suspect their concepts would still refer.
Okay. Have you seen The Prestige at all, Dr. Boyce?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like,
Really interesting.
super interesting. But I had that same worry for him because spoilers, but it's been out forever, everyone. So like he reduplicates himself all the time, and I'm like, well, if he's not the original, then he doesn't have his concepts don't refer. But given semantic externalism, but on this, you're saying there's a chain to back all the way back to the original.
Yeah.
I forgot his
Yeah.
name and the character in there, but Danton or something.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay. But how about let's say he's gone through like 10 permutations or reduplications or whatever. Does the current one, he's the 10th, he's not the original, but he thinks that he is? Does he have, are all his beliefs false because of that? Or how does this affect his like cognitive structure there?
But I think that a lot of his beliefs about the past are false.
Okay.
He believes maybe that he had a certain childhood, that he's more than 5 minutes old.
Yeah.
So those beliefs are false. A lot of his beliefs about the present are still true, though.
Okay. And because he has concepts that do have this chain all the way back, he can still form new ones, no problem.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. This is awesome. This has been really fun. You blew my mind a little bit with the meteorological stuff, which is so cool. Maybe I just want to close on just to be clear. This one's just for me, but like you're a meteorological essentialist. So if we go with like the ship of Theseus, as soon as one board is replaced, it's not his ship any longer, right?
Well, so here it gets a little tricky. It's not
Okay.
the same material object, but I think it's no longer identical to the original material object.
Yeah.
But I think that when we keep track of things in ordinary life, we don't keep track of them by absolute numerical identity.
Yeah.
I think we keep track of them by these loose, as Chisholm put it, loose and popular sortal relative sameness relations.
Yeah.
And so I think that when you replace the board, it's the same ship as the original ship, even though it's not absolutely identical to the original ship.
Okay. And just I'm having a little trouble with like the meteorological universalism and essentialism. Can you help me really quick? Like what if we go in for like unrestricted composition, how do we identify any objects? Is it arbitrary, or do we have a principled way of picking out objects?
Well, so I think that there are some objects that we just, for whatever reasons, because of our interests, because of our biological wiring, we tend to pay attention to.
Okay.
But we can, if we want. If I want, pick out some strange ones right now. I can point to my computer and I can say, I want to talk about the meteorological sum of that thing, and I don't know. I could point at your computer and that thing, and I think that I will have singled out an object. Now, actually, there are some tricky issues there because actually, there's not just one thing I'm pointing to when I point to my computer. There's like, because of the problem of the mini, there are all these different clouds of objects.
But we can go with the sortal thing again, right? We can just say like, where there it's relative, right? Where I'm picking out this relative.
Yeah. So what I want to say is when I talk about my computer, there are perhaps millions of physical objects that are they're all equally good candidates to count as my computer. And I would say they're all computers, but there's only one computer here. Why? Because they're all the same computer. Again, we're keeping track of things not by absolute identity, but sortal relative sameness relations, and they all stand under the same computer relation.
Okay.
So it works a lot like a relative identity view, but it doesn't deny that there is such a thing as absolute numerical identity.
And if we took away one atom from your computer, the meteorological essentialism would say no longer. If we're going strict with it, then it's not the same object any longer.
Yeah, it's not the same material object or thing, whatever. Like, let's pick out a sortal term that sorts things by the relation of absolute numerical identity. It's not the same that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Man, this is so good. I'm gonna have to listen back on this a few times. It's been fantastic. Thanks so much for coming on, Dr. Boyce, and for daring to step outside your area of expertise, even though it is still within your expertise. But because I think exactly what you said, like it's so good to get an outsider's perspective, and this stuff's fantastic. I love what you're doing, and I've been learning a ton from you on Facebook too. So appreciate it. Thanks for doing that.
Well, thanks. I think this is a cool show, and it was fun to be on it. So thank
Awesome.
you.
Thanks. Oh, actually, Dr. Boyce, where can people find more of your stuff before I let you go?
Oh yeah, so you can look me up at the University of Missouri. I also have a website, Kenneth Boyce at kennethboyce.wordpress.com. I think that's it. I don't even remember my own website off the
No
top of my
worries.
head, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's a WordPress site. You can find me by Googling me.
Okay.
Um,
I'll
yeah.
find that WordPress and I'll put it in the description. Well, awesome, folks. That's gonna have to do it for now. My mind is blown. I'm gonna think about this stuff. I'm really just this was so good. But that's gonna have to do it for now. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.